Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and I'm Eve Engler coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. The Canadian Foreign Policy Hour is a critical look at Canada's role abroad. We've been doing this for about 125, 130 weeks. And I'm kind of on a bit of a deadline, so I'm going to get right to it. Try to finish by about 7 o'clock. So of course, there's very bad flooding in Montreal and Toronto again in recent days. Some are saying this is a further sign of climate disturbances. There is a World Court, International Court of Justice hearing on climate change coming up in December that I didn't know about. Interesting. They're going to rule what countries' responsibilities are on the question I guess at the end of the year. Um, and of course, Canada has an outsized per capita emissions, and the Trudeau government is not following through on its modest targets. The Mpox virus, lots of attention on that spreading. I think there's tens and tens of thousands of cases popping up in different parts of the world. It had previously been mostly on the African continent. And one element that I haven't seen talked about in the Canadian media, though it is talked about in some international press and certainly in different Eastern African media, is of course that the war in Eastern Congo has really helped spread the virus, specifically around hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced. I think it's 1.5 million or so displaced, and living in camps where it spreads easy, and very poor health facilities likewise that have contributed to its spread. What I find interesting in this is that I haven't seen that mentioned in the Canadian media. And of course, we will not expect any mention of Canada's support for Rwanda's invasion. Rwanda, of course, has 4,000 troops or so in Eastern Congo, and this is the latest phase of their decades-long uh, um, uh, violence in Eastern Congo, which the Canadian government, including Justin Trudeau, has mostly supported in different ways, as we've talked about in previous sessions. There's a bit of story about Canada apparently has 2 million of these Mpox vaccines, and thus far it's not saying it's willing to give up any of those vaccines for those in Congo and other African countries that are would need those vaccines much more than we do at this point. Trudeau met with or had a call with Prime Minister Gary Conil, who's the imposed, appointed leader in Haiti. And they talked about the backing the multinational security support mission, the Kenyan-led force, Canada supporting that, and sort of Canada in the readout, at least from Trudeau, provided support for that mission. Said Canada wants to provide more support for the mission. Went through the standard line of Haitian-led solutions for Haiti's problems, which is a talking point they always insert to whenever they talk about Haiti, even when it's very clear that it's not a Haitian-led solution at all. And the foreign mission, I think, it's complicated. Whether that's it's certainly not a Haitian-led solution. It's a Washington-led solution. Whether it will turn out well or not, I think is still up to be determined. Though early evidence is not that positive, even on the stated aim of bringing security. So Canada continues to be a major player in Haiti, as we know, as we've talked about in this, and Trudeau continues that policy. There was an interesting post, I thought, in terms of just a comment on the state of thinking on international affairs. Apparently, the New York Times has more paying digital Canadian subscribers than any Canadian news organization. So I guess more than the Globe, more than the Toronto Star. I guess those would be the two main possible, or I guess in French, maybe Le Devoir or La Presse is free. So yeah, so that's I think kind of interesting. It says a bit about where people get their news. From the standpoint of international coverage, the New York Times actually much better international coverage than any Canadian outlet. Certainly, it's the scope of New York Times international coverage. It's obviously biased towards the U.S. empire, but it has pretty extensive coverage. On that note of the Canadian media and the question of the US and how US centric we are, today's Globe and Mail op-ed page has three op-eds. Two of them are basically about the Democratic Convention, even though Saturday's paper, the front is all about the Democratic Party convention in Chicago. And two of them are just, sort of like kind of US, very US centric op-eds about Democratic Party and success. I don't know why there would be hardly any of that in the Canadian media, let alone two in one op-ed page. But and then the third op-ed was the U.S. must correct its Ukraine policy, and basically saying that Kamala Harris has this opportunity to correct the U.S. Ukraine policy. And you see the headline and you think, oh, okay, so they're saying we're going to try to get some negotiation, we're going to try to, dial back the belligerents and figure out. In fact, of course, it's the total opposite. It's how now they can really get serious on Ukraine and they can pump even more weapons, even more money into supporting the proxy war, and that's apparently Kamala Harris's big opportunity to figure things out. It's just reflective of there is only one point of view allowed really in the dominant media on Ukraine. I would say even more than Gaza and the horrors there, where you do get little bits of sort of truthfulness that kind of gets through. In the case of Ukraine, NATO proxy war, it is just a totally one-sided. There is nothing about the context of U.S. Canadian provocation and U.S. Canadian prolongation of the war. That's just basically not acceptable opinion to make it in the dominant media. And in that vein, this week I think it's a pretty important escalation. We talked about a bit last week about how Ukrainian forces are incursion into Russian territory, and they're doing that, of course, they're not officially, but in practice and in reality, we know, with backing of NATO, the US, Canada. And that should be a big story. I mean, that has the potential to really escalate. Now, this week, what came to light is that they're using Canadian armored vehicles were photographed in Russia, and that was in and of itself kind of an important development. But then the Canadian government's reaction to it was even more, I think, dangerous, which was basically, yeah, the Ukrainians have the right to use Canadian weapons anywhere they want to use Canadian weapons. We see no problem with using them in Russian territory. And so that's the state of things. There's no reaction to that, as far as I know. No, the NDP doesn't say, "Hey, maybe that is pushing us one step closer towards nuclear Armageddon, or one step closer towards an open, direct conflict between the U.S., Canada, and Russia." None of that. That's not. No one in official politics, no one in the media would even sort of raise that concern, and it's sort of a non-story. Using Canadian weapons in Russia is a non-story by the Canadian media, and the question of what's going on in with Ukrainian strategy is an interesting one. I don't really know, but it seems like this is some sort of PR strategy from the Ukrainian government to show they can have some success. And I think they have had some military success. They've gotten a fair bit of Russian troops to stand down, to give themselves up. They've obviously captured a certain amount of Russian territory. Not many people. They're mostly small villages and towns that but they've captured a certain amount of territory. The idea is that they could potentially exchange that in a some sort of negotiation. I'm a little skeptical of that. My expectation is that Russia is going to drive the Ukrainian troops out. It might take a little while, but they are going to drive Ukrainian troops out of the Kursk region. Uh, the other part, I think, the kind of maybe the more dangerous element to all this. Well, first of all, it's from a Ukrainian military perspective, it's taking much needed personnel away from the Donetsk where they're losing and other parts where they're on the back foot. So that's a bit of an interesting question militarily. I think there's also a bigger picture question, and the reality is that Putin is actually somebody who is a kind of more sober-minded person within the Russian political sphere. And I saw a story about the most left-wing party, I believe, in the Duma, the Russian parliament, that they're calling like a really hard line position. I forget exactly what they were calling for now, but it was like basically like let's bomb Eastern Ukraine, let's press it. And I saw a story also about um, uh, Medev is it Mev, anyways, the former who was the prime minister for a while, and then he was the president for a while, and now I believe he's the I forget what his official position is. He's top security advisor, I believe, to Putin, or the head of the parliament security committee or something. I forget. Anyways, it's still a prominent Russian official, and he's been a hard line a person over the past 2.5 years, 2.5 years. But his line was just this total hawkish. Okay, we gotta, this is an example of Ukrainian terrorism when we're going to go all in. We got to take all of these regions. We got to make Kyiv fall and the like. It seems to me that the Russians are trying to use this to pressure Belarusia, should I say, to intervene. And there's the comments from the president of Belarusia that suggest that they said he's claiming that there's 120,000 Ukrainian troops on their border, which of course there aren't. That would make no sense militarily from a country that desperately needs personnel to push back against Russian advances. But it seems to me like that is maybe setting up the stage for their entering Ukraine, invading Ukraine. And that would be, I think, part of a potential new attack against Kyiv. I don't know if this is actually going on, but this seems like this may be a factor in. And so, in fact, while it may be embarrassing for Putin and for the Russian government to have Ukrainian soldiers controlling a chunk of their territory, if they can use this as a way, and because Belarus has a security pact with Russia, if they can use this as a way to justify, to prod their involvement in the war, then that might serve their purposes. So the Russians, I saw a story just saying that they're saying now there's no negotiations because of this. Now, of course, the Ukrainians can respond by saying, legitimately at one level that Russia's taking our territory. Russia's got 20% of our country and is bombing all over and da da da. And so I think there's a very legitimate moral case to say, well, we're going to take the fight to you or whatnot. But there's these broader questions that of where all this goes that need to be part of the calculation. The National Post published a piece. I think it was from Bernie. Is it Derek Bernie, who was the former? He was in the Mulroney government. I'm not sure what the position was. He was Canadian ambassador to the U.S. and he was a prominent commentator, right-wing commentator. His National Post op-ed about a week ago. I'm not sure. I forget what date it was. And he talks about how Mike Pompeo and this other guy had this Wall Street Journal op-ed about what the winning strategy is in Ukraine. And part of this winning strategy was, of course, massively increasing a NATO support for Ukraine, but also massively increasing NATO spending. And now they're throwing out that now the NATO commitment should be 3% of GDP to military spending. So we're in this whole process of getting Canada to 2%, and now you're getting these calls for the 3%, and we know that was where this was all going, but it's I think important to see that play out. Very dubious suggestion. On the note of NATO and NATO belligerence, HMCS Charlottetown a couple days ago, as part of the standing NATO Maritime Group 2, doing something they're called PASEX, and a number of NATO vessels are doing maneuvers with Japanese naval vessels, obviously in the near China, as part of this deepening relationship between NATO and Japan, which is part of this target China kind of policy. On the China file, there's again, this story. I keep talking about this story, but it's really discussed a lot in the business pages of the Globe and Mail and Financial Post. And there's a story about the Chinese subsidiary suing the Canadian government for the Pan American Silver agreement, a $300 million sale of a stake in Peru's La Arena gold mine to this Singapore-based subsidiary of a Chinese company, Zijing Mining Group. And so the Chinese company is suing the Canadian government, basically saying you don't really have the right to do this. And this is all part of these controls that the Trudeau government has brought in on minerals. To the idea is that strategic minerals to avoid the Chinese dominating these strategic minerals. But this case, it seems like it's a gold and copper mine. And I don't think gold fits the strategic, and I don't think copper was supposed to be part of the strategic minerals either, but maybe it was. But so they're suing Canada, and this is a big issue in the business pages again, and this whole question of how this is undermining the Canadian mining sector, these constraints. Canadian mining companies, what they do in large part is they are the explorers. They are the juniors. They find the minerals, and then they try to find a bigger company to buy them out, and that can be a very profitable endeavor. And there are all around the world buying up other countries or taking over other countries' natural resources, and then often trying to sell themselves or sell a stake of themselves to some other bigger company that has better capacities to extract or to sometimes refine the product. And so this is really potentially threatening to Canada as a global mining powerhouse. One of the things that's really important I mentioned this previously, maybe I haven't mentioned it enough, is that the extent to which the campaigning and the concern on when it came to human rights standards for Canadian mining companies operating internationally, right? The Canadian government is always campaigning for decades around an ombudsperson, and the Canadian government, both uh, conservative and liberal, are like, no, we can't do this, and part of it is, oh, this could hurt our industry. But when it becomes like a geopolitical U.S. empire imperative to bring in these restrictions, it's like it's a snap of a finger. And even when the likely impact on, or the potential impact on Canada as a global mining powerhouse is being felt, they're still willing to do it because the U.S. empire wants it, because it's for geostrategic big power reasons, you can bring in restrictions on Canadian mining companies. But when it's for just not killing people, or not destroying ecosystems or waterways of local indigenous communities, that's not actually important. So we can't put any restrictions on them for that. And we should also mention the restrictions were just about no public support for companies found to be engaged in those major abuses. So it shows you how so much of Canadian foreign policy is about corporate profit and empire. Those are the two things. Sometimes sometimes they are in opposition. Mostly they aren't, but sometimes they are. And then you'll have it really fight out on the business pages of the Globe and Mail. And I was thinking about this. The Globe and Mail's business pages at this point, there's basically nothing good in the main section of the Globe and Mail about China. Okay, there's sort of like no, what one could call like a defense of China in one way or another in the main section. It's just bad China, bad China. But in the business section, I wouldn't say it's exactly a defense of China, these op-eds, but it's certainly a defense of the right to make money and to have exchange with China. There's quite a bit of that. And I would say it's even maybe the dominant position in the op-ed page of the business section of the Globe and Mail. Not, again, the op-ed page of the front section, the main section, is basically, for every defend China op-ed, there's probably 99, 98, whatever, of attack China. In the business section, it's different, and that I think is it's just a little sort of microcosm of the bigger kind of how Canadian foreign policy functions, and what are the forces that are listened to, and the structural questions. On China and the failure, the U.S. There's a couple of stories about Huawei. I think I mentioned maybe last week, but a couple more. I saw different posts about basically the American strategy of kneecapping the high tech sector in China is really not succeeding. The obvious example was with Huawei, and they're basically surprised how quickly Huawei has been able to kind of leapfrog and has continued the chip. They got these chips being cut off, the cutting edge chips, mostly from Taiwan, I believe. I think the Netherlands is also involved in some of this production, and the Americans able to get this kind of the trade cut off. But the Chinese companies have done very well at just basically figuring out. There's one story I saw is that they're not necessarily on the total, the most cutting edge chips are still not there, but the whole sort of startup ecosystem, I guess, or sort of high tech sector within China, that was actually having a difficulty getting the big companies like Huawei, and I don't know the names. I can't remember the names of the other big tech companies in China. These smaller Chinese companies were having difficulty getting them to source their product domestically. But what's happened is that the American sanctions policy has basically forced Huawei and the other big Chinese tech companies to see the importance of the local industry and building a local industry and kind of like collectively moving things forward. And so the basic point here is that this American strategy has been disastrous. It's actually just seems like it's leading to China moving. Huawei had this like a 2-year dip in sales and stuff like that, but now it's actually back ahead of where it was. And so and it looks like the Chinese are going to be moving along quite quickly with these high tech chips that principally Taiwan and I guess the Netherlands are at the cutting edge of. So what and the other thing kind of tied to that, and it also kind of connected to the Canadian mining industry, is there's these other stories. I saw a story about the German investment in China. The German companies, while the German government is putting all these comments and pressure, basically cut back on China investment, cut back on reliance on China, and this and that. In fact, the German companies just keep continuing, and they keep increasing their investments. And I think I reported that last week or 2 weeks ago about Canadian trade with China. And basically, the Hill Times is this piece saying that Canadian trade is up with China, and how it's sort of the government strategy of trying to de-link from China is unsuccessful. And so we're seeing that in Canada, we're seeing that in Germany, and so basically the corporate world it's just too big a market. It's too, I guess, dynamic. And there's just money to be made. And so the corporate world is sort of like continuing along in their China policy, while the U.S. government and other governments are trying to sort of push back on that. Israel continues its horrors in Gaza. Of course, there's a Bloomberg story about the amount of destruction and how long it would take. 42 million tons, I believe, of, and this graph of how much has been destroyed and how many years, decades it will take. And then there's all these bodies under the rubble, and then there's unexploded ordnance, and then there's poisonous materials, and how that's going to cost so much to rebuild, or even just to move, to get rid of. And then there's destruction is so heavy that even when the horrors stop and these displacements, and the Israelis keep, like, there's most, I think, I don't know, but most people has been displaced like a dozen times in Gaza. And so even when it all stops and they go towards some sort of reconstruction, people are all going to be displaced again, because they're going to have to, there's so much destruction that it's going to make sense to just sort of wipe out, I guess, whole areas, and have people live somewhere else while it gets sort of rebuilt. So this is just we're seeing polio cases, dozens and dozens killed again today. So it's all continuing. It's pretty amazing to see this play out. Now, the Canadian government is, despite this now 300 and whatever days of genocide and Holocaust in Gaza, they obviously have these $95 million in outstanding export arms permits that are still active. That even with this ending of new permits that they announced multiple months ago, are still they're still active permits that they're processing. And then it was reported by the Maple, I'm not sure who uncovered this, but by the Maple, that the big U.S. arms package to Israel that was announced 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, that $20 billion package, that 83 million Canadian, I think it was like 61 million US, is for 50,000 mortars and fuses from the General Dynamics facility here in Montreal. And just on a parentheses, that General Dynamics facility, I'm pretty sure, is the one that they purchased from SNC-Lavalin. And the SNC-Lavalin used to have this, I think called SNC Tech, which was a fairly small part of the whole engineering company. But SNC Tech got this big contract to provide bullets to the U.S. military during the occupation of Iraq. And there was this Financial Times story that I actually saw in the paper and raised about this contract, because America's using so many bullets, they had to go. As I think wording was, we're using so many bullets, we have to go international with our sourcing. And so they got this big contract to SNC Tech, and then we campaigned on that. This group, Block the Empire, that I was part of here in Montreal, and we actually got, and it spread. There was an SNC Board of Governors meeting in Toronto in I think like late 2005, maybe early 2006. There's a Toronto Now article about this, and they got a good protest. Got like 3, 4, 500 people that protested, and I think it got kind of heated, and SNC sold off its bullet production, I guess mortars as well. I'm not sure what they did at the time. Uh, Facility to General Dynamics I believe it was in 2006. So it was a sort of small victory of anti-war activism. And so, General Dynamics is an arms company, so it would be very different dynamic. SNC was willing to move because it was embarrassing. They're sort of they're very tied into governments, and bad PR is not good, and bullet production and arms was not an important part of what they were doing. So they were quite responsive to the protest. It was like a 6 month or 1 year turnaround, really. It was quite quick that they got them to divest of this part of their bigger operations. But nonetheless, so back to the here and now. So this big arms thing, a sale. Now, only reason we know about this is because the Americans actually mention it in their announcement about the sale to the or donation/sale. And it's not exactly clear if this arms package is mostly a donation or mostly a sale. It's framed as mostly a sale. Whether Israel will ultimately pay for it all, I don't know. But so it was announced. The Canadian arms bit of it was announced by the U.S. And so General Dynamics, like the Bill Blair, the defense minister, just two days before this story broke, he was asked by some activists. There's a video of it I posted on my Twitter account. I think Canadians for Justice, Peace in the Middle East shared it. That is Canada selling? We want an arms embargo, two-way arms embargo. It's not. And he's like, no, Canada's not sending any weapons to Israel. Okay, so we always knew that was a lie. I mean, they have these outstanding permits that they're allowing, but they're saying that as of January 8th, there was no new permits okayed, and then just the permits that were in the pipeline are being processed. Okay, but now we have this like confirmation. We knew this, of course, that through Canada's relationship to the U.S. military, that the weapons are flowing, right? And it's fascinating. This wouldn't even be announced. We wouldn't even be documented by the Canadian government, this arms shipment to the U.S. to then send to Israel, except for the fact that Americans announce it. And that's because we have this thing called the Defense Production Sharing Arrangement, which goes back to the late 1950s, which the U.S. government treats Canadian arms producers as basically just U.S. arms producers. It's just part of the U.S. Military industrial base. And so half or more of Canada's international arms sales, we don't know anything about, or we only know little bits when the U.S. announces it, or there's some other way in which it becomes public. And so the Defense Production Sharing Arrangement is this important part of Canadian foreign policy. The Americans, when they pushed this, when they agreed to this and pushed it, now we make this really clear. This is very valuable to Canadian companies, because to be treated like American companies, that is unique. You have the biggest arms purchaser in the world, and you're getting treated in this very special relationship. Now, much of, if not most of, Canada's arms industry is branch plants of U.S. companies, so like General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin Canada, etc. But that's even that in of itself is kind of interesting, because they often export globally from Canada. So Canada is quite successful in its arms industry. It's not just a sort of like branch plant in the kind of most negative sense of that with the U.S. But one of the reasons why the Americans agreed to this back in the mid-50s was this is a 1958 U.S. national security document, described the importance of maintaining a, quote, healthy Canadian defense industry for the U.S. to, quote, receive the same excellent cooperation in the joint defense effort that has prevailed in the past. So basically, by giving Canadian industry this special sale deal to the Pentagon, they would be lobbyists for Canada to follow a pro-US foreign policy or pro-US military policy. That's basically what the Americans were saying when they signed it. That, of course, has come true. It was a very smart move on the Americans' perspective. And it's also true that it's been very good for Canadian arms industry. I would also suggest, as a theme I've mentioned in previous and as a bigger theme on Canadian foreign policy, that the Canadian government and the Canadian elite like these sort of accords, international accords, be that NATO, be that NORAD, be that Five Eyes, that sort of legitimate doing things that there may have been political opposition to doing. Okay, so we have to do this because we have this defense production sharing arrangement. The Canadian government cannot step in and say, no, don't sell 50,000 mortars, even though we're saying there's an arms embargo on Israel. Don't sell 50,000 mortars to the Israeli military. They won't do that because they'll say, well, this is part of this defense production sharing arrangement. Just like they'll say, well, we got to go bomb Libya because we're part of NATO. We got to pull our weight. We have to increase military spending because we have to pull our weight in NATO. Or we have to get Huawei out of our 5G network because we're part of the Five Eyes, and that's part of being part of this alliance. So these alliances become like justifying tools for policies that the government and or elites would basically be fine with anyways, and it provides kind of like a deflection, or if you like, in one sense, in terms of the public. There's a piece about Unravel that mentions the genocide, Canada Parliament, Senate, defining the Rohingya, Myanmar, the killing is a genocide back in 2018. The Uyghur in February 21, genocide, Russia's actions in Ukraine, genocide. And of course, there's nothing about what the International Court of Justice calls the plausible genocide, and which is much more straightforward genocidal intent when you have Minister Smoldrich of the Israeli government saying, we want to starve the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, saying it openly. And so that's always really important to contrast. There's a story in the Canadian press about Canada demands investigation into water well destroyed by Israeli troops in Gaza. And about 3 weeks ago, they blew up this, what was called the Canada well. They filmed themselves doing it, Israeli engineers. And apparently, according to this, there's been the mayor or the official in the area of Rafah, I believe it was, says that 30 of these wells have been destroyed by the Israeli military in recent months. But the story is kind of an interesting one because it seems like the story is sort of trying to say that it's not clear if Canada actually did finance this well. Canada, I guess CETA back in the late 90s or early 2000s had financed a number of projects in this area. And so they'd become called, like, the Palestinians referred to as like the Canada zone or the Canada something or other. So the thinking was, or the initial kind of reports was that this well also was the Canada well, but it's not actually sure if Canada did actually. The IDRC, I believe, is the what does IDRC stand for? International Development and Research Center, I think maybe. It's Ottawa Crown Corporation, I believe it's Crown Corporation, sort of a little bit removed from the government, though obviously most of its money is the government, but it's got a little bit of independence. But anyway, so the story seems to sort of be trying to kind of disprove that Canada was actually the one that financed it, and it's sort of like, well, maybe it's okay that Israel blew it up if Canada didn't finance it. But anyways, the Canadian government's line on this is obviously totally ridiculous. We want an investigation. Well, we don't need an investigation. They posted it on Twitter and social media, them blowing it up. It's not like they weren't denying it. The Israeli engineers are the ones that posted it. We need a condemnation. We need some sort of punishment for doing it, etc. The Canadian police chiefs, there's a story, Canada's police chiefs call for more help to deal with increasing number of protests. Okay, so we need to put more money into the police because of all these anti-genocide protests. And the Ontario Police Association head is quoted in this article saying, immigration, he added, has brought in some people from parts of the world where the use of violence is, quote, an acceptable vehicle for social change. But he didn't name countries. So you got this Ontario Police Association head saying some countries where violence is an acceptable vehicle of social change, implying it's Arabs or Muslims, and because it's about the genocide protests, and but then doesn't name names. This is all part of this sort of theme, right? This sort of the fascist Zionist fascism theme. It's something that obviously Jewish Zionists are pushing, but it's also much more broadly being taken up by the political institutions and other Zionist organizations that Christian, atheist, whatever Zionist kind of disposition. On this front, there's a story saying calls are growing for Canada to declare the inverted red triangle, according to the story, commonly used in this country by Hamas sympathizers and anti-Israel extremists to target and intimidate as a hate symbol. So now this inverted triangle, red triangle, may be banned, or there's a push for as a hate symbol. I actually don't know what this. I've seen the symbol a bit. I know they claim it's some sort of Palestine symbol, but we're gonna try to get that banned by some Zionist forces are pushing that. Anthony Housefather and Deborah Lyons, the two special envoys on anti-Semitism. One wasn't enough, so we got two now with Anthony Housefather joining. They sent a letter to, I think, all universities in the country, preparing for the upcoming school year, that they have to do a whole series of things to protect Jewish students, Jewish safety. Part of that is to basically ban BDS campaigning. And so basically what they're saying is you have to violate Canada's charter, domestic law, and the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which is saying that states have a responsibility to not enable Israel's colony in the West Bank. There's a big push against Pride in Ottawa. It's a full throttle campaign going at Pride for a pretty a decent statement, but definitely nothing a very trying to be, in my opinion, way too even-handed statement from Ottawa Pride on the question of genocide, and so there's a big campaign to basically try to sabotage it. You just saw that the Liberal Party just announced a bunch of these different hospital pulled out, different sponsors, these different city councilors saying, the mayor's saying he's not intending, etc., etc. It's a big campaign to try to sabotage Pride and send a message, of course. The National Post has this front page piece: Radical MP Atwin abandons New Brunswick Jews. And Jenica Atwin, the former Green Party person, MP who went to the Liberals, and basically saying that she's I don't know, attacking the small Jewish community in Fredericton. And it concludes saying the voters of Fredericton have a choice. They can either continue sending someone to Parliament whose political career is defined by her anti-Israel obsession, or they can send a different MP who is willing to speak up for and protect every single one of their constituents, including the members of their small Jewish community. It's just an endless stream of this kind of stuff. Um, the On a more positive note, on the JNF and Naaman Foundation revocation of their charter status, I think the JNF one is the biggest victory in the history of Canadian Palestine activism. I think it is quite a significant victory. It has international ramifications, has domestic ramifications. I expect there are going to be a whole series more charities that are already that the CRA has already decided they're going to basically revoke. I don't see how they could go at the JNF as powerful as the JNF is, and it's powerful. I mean, Harper just twice spoke to two different JNF events, 10 days ago. Tons of ministers. The JNF has got all these operations across the country. I was looking on the site. Hadn't been paying attention to JNF much in a while, and huge operation. About $200 million they've raised over the past decade, and of course it's a linchpin of Zionism, right? This goes back more than a century. Alongside the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, and so there's international ramifications. I think that there's a good chance it's because of the racism, and that will be really important. If it is because of JNF racism and not just the funding of West Bank colonies and the Israeli military, if it's because of the racism of the institution, which it of course is, it's an inherently racist organization. That's its raison d'être, is racism. That will further strengthen the global campaign. I'm doing this story, I haven't published it yet, about arguing that this is like a victory for anti-genocide, anti-apartheid, anti-racism, fiscal conservatives, Canadian nationalists, but also child advocates. And basically, the JNF is this indoctrination entity of young Jews, right? And the blue box that they get young kids is like the UNICEF box. I remember when I was 6 or 7 and Halloween, I think we had those UNICEF boxes, raise money for UNICEF. But these blue boxes are about raising money, getting young Jewish kids to raise money for colonization of Palestine. But there's a whole ideological part to it. And then there's that's an important, been doing that for 100 years, the blue boxes. But then there's this more explicit ideological part within JNF Canada. They have a whole education emissary, and they have these JNF days at schools. They bring educators to Israel. And it's all like they don't even hide that they include the West Bank as their map of Israel and stuff like that. They're, even within the parameters of Zionism, of today's Zionism, they take very, aggressive expansionist positions. And so it's this really important tool in that process of indoctrinating young kids into this supremacist genocidal ideology. And so going at the JNF is important at that front. And of course, it's not the only one, right? We have the B'nai Avika school I just wrote about, or maybe talked about last week or the week before, where they induce a quarter of the kids to join the Israeli military. You have Tannenbaum Chat, also registered charities. These are all registered charities that we've put complaints in around that indoctrinate kids as well, get them to join the Israeli military. So there's a whole apparatus. There's these day camps. There's the elementary schools, or even daycares that are part of this indoctrination apparatus with regards to young Canadian Jews. The whole milieu needs to be challenged. It needs to be challenged in their charitable status. It needs to be just challenged, politically. And so there's that element with the JNF thing. In this stuff on JNF, and going back and looking at it, there's this access to information that Ron Saba got back I think in 2011. I quoted it in a story I wrote about the JNF right away. after the revocation became public, where they mentioned this 2011 talk I gave in Ottawa, and the foreign affairs official are communicating with the CRA officials that I'm doing this talk and about the JNF and like that, monitor that. So the point that Saba is uncovering with this and is that the CRA was aware of the JNF stuff going back a long, long time. They were monitoring opposition to the JNF, and they were literally stating explicitly, Ron Saba has this big list. The media, one of the emails says, they haven't been able to get any mainstream media attention, but he has a big list, so they might get mainstream media attention at some point. So they're like concerned about the media impact of this campaigning that is taking place. Now, in this access to information they got that I read way back when, but 10 years ago, whatever, I forgot about, of course. They mentioned 4 different charities, registered charities, that they say are supporting projects in the West Bank. One of them is Canadian Friends of Yeshiva Birkat Moshe Male Adum. Well, at least one of them, I think a couple, are still charities. That's interesting. But also they mentioned these 4 very kind of marginal sounding named charities. But then they also mentioned the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association as supporting West Bank settlements. Well, we, of course, a couple of years ago began a campaign around the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association's charitable status. They were explicitly listed on an Israeli military site as having assisted, as being one of the arms to assist financially the Israeli military. They had some groups in the UK, I believe, in the US, maybe it was Australia. I don't remember the other countries. And basically, like, if you want to support the IDF, give money to this organization, and they have a charitable status. That was essentially what was on the IDF website. Now, that's so explicitly against CRA rules. So I'm really interested to see what happens with the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association. So it's been on their radar for 12 years. And what's coming out around the JNF is that, in fact, the JNF's been on their radar for this stuff. That an audit began back in 2014. So the work, like the formal complaint that I believe was submitted in 2017, that comes like years after the whole process began within the CRA. So this has been playing out internally for a long, long, long time. So the campaigning that's gone on going back to 1978, of course, with Ismail Zaid, where he found out that Canada Park was built on the village that he was displaced from, him and his family displaced from in 67. So there's some interesting stuff on the charities. Like I said, I expect some more good stuff to come on the charities in coming months. There's plans afoot, haven't been publicly announced, but we're looking at it. September 5th is International Day of Charity, Global Day. And so there's a plan to do some actions at CRA offices on that day across the country. And anyone who wants to help out with that, be in touch with me. We're going to be coming out with some of this information in soon. Now, I've gone on way too long again. A couple other things I did want to talk about. The encampments quickly. The VIU, the Vancouver Island University was taken down. They had a court decision. They were on, I think, 110 days in Nanaimo there. I went by that camp. It's great. They're a great crew. I talked to them for a while. Amazing stuff. There's a story in the Middle Eastern Monitor about the encampments, so like what they gained. And basically what I was left with is that on a per camp, it wasn't very much, right? Most Canadian and US camps, the administrations didn't concede much. But actually, when you look at the global movement, they got lots. And there's like dozens of examples of fairly significant concessions in Spain, Denmark, some in the UK. Windsor is a good one in Canada. So there was actually fairly... So it's like a weird one where, maybe it's only like 10% or 20% of the encampments, got what we call a significant victory beyond just a general protest, opposition to genocide, but on their administrations. But the whole move, like it was a movement, and they all one got going, helped the others and others, and so in the sum total, it's actually quite significant what was won, even if in the on a percentage basis it's not that good. Maybe the final thing two final things. One, Scotiabank subsidiary cutting a lot of its stake in Elbit. They cut down from, they were at 5% at one point. I think they were above 5%. They're now down to 1.4 or 1.14. So that pressure has clearly got to Scotiabank. Story in the Financial Times: money managers debate Israeli assets amid mounting death toll in Gaza. Whole bunch of stories in different business outlets and the like about how more and more places are companies or even governments that were buying Israel bonds and stuff like that, bailing on the matter. And finally, the United Church of Canada sent a letter to Prime Minister Trudeau calling on Canada to recall its ambassador to Israel, revoke the credentials of the Israeli ambassador, put in place a two-way arms embargo, suspend the Canada Free Trade Agreement, or at least the part that's supporting the occupation. And that's a big step forward. I will leave it at that. I'm going to try to keep it only to a handful of minutes for questions and comments, and I will make Laura a co-host if I can find her. And yeah, go ahead, anyone if it has a Catherine. I see Catherine. I'm gonna let you go ahead, Catherine, as I try to find Laura here.
Hi. Yeah, I had a couple of interest. Are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you well. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I had couple of interesting things with CBC. Today I was listening to Democracy Now! From a couple weeks ago, I think it was a week and a half ago, maybe. And they had a CBC reporter on the show about the Olympics. Her name is Shireen Ahmed, and she was calling in from PEI, and talked about the stuff about Trump and J.K. Rowling going after the boxer who they were falsely claiming was trans, and all this transphobic stuff about that. But then she also talked about the refugee team, and that the number of refugees in the world, and that that doesn't include the Palestinian refugees and who are undergoing genocide. And she said it really loudly. And it's just interesting that they're not allowed to say.
Catherine, you've been muted somehow, not by me, and now you've disappeared. Catherine I don't know if you can see, but she disappeared from my screen.
Yeah, she disappeared from my screen as well. Is there anyone else has comment?
She was the only one that had their hand up, so I think you can go to wherever it is you have to get to.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Take care.